In April 1987, a cave diver went 91 feet down into a flooded Florida sinkhole and found a wall. Not a natural limestone formation, not a collapsed ceiling feature, not the kind of geological anomaly that gets filed under interesting and moved past. A wall, fitted limestone blocks stacked in 5 even courses, joints so tight a dive knife would not seep between them, with a worn channel cut along the top course that suggested not a single construction event, but centuries of repeated use. He surfaced, sat on the dock for 11 minutes without speaking, then asked to use the telephone. Subscribe now, because the geology of what that wall requires has never been addressed by any institution with the authority to address it. What he called first was not the state, not a newspaper. He called a hydrogeologist at the University of Florida, a woman who had spent the previous decade charting the Florida aquifer system for the Regional Water Management District, someone who understood exactly what the water table in that part of Alachua County meant for anything found at that depth. She drove up from Gainesville that same afternoon, went in herself the following morning. Her field notes from that dive survive in a folder a colleague kept for years after she left the university. They describe the wall in identical terms: tight coursing, worn channel, no mortar visible anywhere in the joints. They add one detail the original diver had not mentioned. Behind a gap where one block had slipped, her light picked out a second structure, a low platform running along the chamber's far side, and resting on it, coated in the fine grey silt that settles on anything left undisturbed underwater for a very long time, was a worked stone bowl, its rim chipped in one place, otherwise whole. 3 days of her notebook are missing. Not blank pages left for later entries, removed. The stubs where 3 sheets had been torn free are still visible along the spiral binding, and the entry that resumes on the Friday after her dive makes no reference to the chamber at all, as though the notebook had been edited to skip past the one event that made those days worth recording. She filed an internal memo recommending a follow-up survey with proper photogrammetry and requesting departmental support to bring in a credentialed archaeologist before the site could be disturbed further. The support did not come through normal channels. What did come was 2 men she never named, who spent an afternoon alone with her in a closed office, and left carrying her only complete set of dive slides from the chamber. She never published. Her research output in the 3 years that followed shows a hard and total turn away from cave systems, published work on surface water nutrient loading, septic contamination, subjects with no meaningful overlap to the cave mapping work that had defined her entire career to that point. She left the university in 1991. The sinkhole was fenced by 1994. A heavy steel grate was bolted over the entrance shaft the following spring. The permit record lists the applicant as a land management firm and gives no reason beyond general liability. The Florida aquifer system has been reconstructed from core samples and cave sediment analysis, reaching back through multiple glacial cycles. Those reconstructions place dry, air-filled conditions in chambers at that depth only during periods of dramatically lower sea level, the kind associated with full glacial maxima, when so much of the planet's water was locked into continental ice sheets that the ocean itself stood far below its current shoreline. The most recent such window closed roughly 12,000 years ago, which means whoever built that wall, who quarried, dressed and stacked fitted limestone blocks in 5 even courses inside that chamber, did the work during the last ice age at minimum. The accepted archaeological record for the Florida Peninsula does not currently extend past roughly 14,000 to 15,000 years. A finished wall in a chamber that was last plausibly dry before that window opens does not sit at the edge of the accepted timeline. It sits on the other side of it. On the far side of a line nobody in the accepted record has drawn a bridge across. The chamber has not been surveyed since her dive in April 1987. The grate is still bolted over the shaft. The wall is still down there, dressed limestone standing level to within 2 inches in the dark, waiting on the far side of a restriction most divers will never be cleared to pass. And the sequence of events between her dive and the grate going up, the missing notebook pages, the unnamed men, the career that turned hard away from cave systems, the out-of-state holding company that has never granted an interview, is where this investigation actually begins. Cutter's Sink would be easier to dismiss if it stood alone. It does not. 240 miles south at Little Salt Spring near Northport, divers working with the University of Miami through the 1970s documented a sharpened wooden stake driven into the bank of a submerged basin alongside the remains of an extinct giant tortoise. Radiocarbon dated to roughly 12,000 years. Evidence accepted into the published record specifically because the stake was organic and datable in a way that fitted stone masonry never can be. The basin drops in a series of shelves to a depth of over 200 feet. The deepest of those shelves has never been fully mapped by any team willing to put its findings into print. Access has been tightly restricted since the original surveys, formally justified on safety grounds that apply equally to hundreds of other Florida cave systems that were never fenced with the same urgency or the same speed. 90 miles further south at Warm Mineral Springs, human skeletal remains dated to comparable age were recovered during the 1950s and 60s, briefly making the site a fixture of regional archaeology, drawing research teams from as far as Europe in the years immediately following the first recoveries. Then access narrowed. The deepest basin closed to independent divers for stretches lasting years at a time, reopened only under tightly managed permit conditions few outside academic institutions were ever granted. A 1972 survey report notes in its closing line that further excavation below a stated depth was deferred pending additional funding. The surviving grant records show that funding was never applied for by anyone connected to the original team. 3 sites, 3 discoveries pressing against the edge of the accepted timeline, 3 periods of brief legitimate scientific interest, generating real publications and real credentials, followed in each case by the same narrowing. Quiet, procedural, dressed in the language of safety and property rights, with the practical effect of keeping the deepest and oldest looking material out of reach of anyone without institutional sponsorship, and often out of reach of the sponsoring institutions themselves once continued investigation might require them to say something uncomfortable in public. This is not dramatic suppression, no classified files, no coordinated conspiracy. It is the ordinary operation of institutional priorities that reward research within established categories and produce no funding pathway for anything that sits outside them. The category closes, the permit lapses, the grate goes up, and the question stops being asked, not because it was answered, but because the mechanism that generates answers has been quietly pointed somewhere else. Now, the dimension this investigation has that changes the shape of everything above it. The people who occupied this peninsula before the ice retreated were not silent about what the water covered when it rose. The Calusa, who held South Florida at the time of European contact, maintained oral traditions describing their ancestors as having come from territory that no longer existed in the same form, a landscape progressively reduced by rising water across generations so distant that the tradition could no longer precisely locate what had been lost, only that it existed, that it was inhabited, and that the water took it. Ethnographers working in the late 19th century recorded fragments of these accounts, descriptions of springs and rivers and settlements placed in directions that now point out across open water. Geographic memory preserved across the millennia it took the sea to cover what the tradition was remembering. Those fragments were documented once, filed in the same federal archives where Mooney's Cherokee fieldwork has been sitting since the turn of the 20th century, and never formally compared to the underwater sites appearing in the same geographic range. That comparison has never been funded, never been published, and the access restrictions that keep the deepest chambers sealed make it structurally impossible to conduct even if someone wanted to, which means the underwater archaeology and the oral tradition are sitting in separate institutional categories, pointing at the same water, and nobody with the authority to put them in the same room has ever tried. The 3 Florida sites are not randomly distributed. Little Salt Spring, Warm Mineral Springs, and Cutter's Sink all sit within the geographic range of the Calusa and their predecessors, within the territory where the oral traditions describe drowned land, within the zone where the glacial-era Florida landmass extended furthest into what is now open water. That geographic clustering is not proof, it is a pattern. And the pattern generates a question the access restrictions make it impossible to answer. During the last glacial maximum, roughly 20,000 years ago, sea levels globally stood approximately 300 to 400 feet below their current position, which means the Florida Peninsula was not a peninsula. It was a landmass roughly twice its current size, extending far out into what is now the Gulf of Mexico and the Atlantic Ocean, with rivers, springs, forests, and the same limestone karst terrain that produces sinkholes and cave systems across modern Florida today. The springs that now bubble up from the aquifer onto the ocean floor were surface features on that landscape. The sinkholes that now sit flooded were dry. The cave systems that divers enter today through flooded restrictions were accessible on foot. Any civilization that occupied that landscape left its material evidence not on the modern Florida surface, but on the submerged shelf, exactly where systematic archaeological survey has never been conducted. That shelf is not empty. Freshwater springs have been documented bubbling up from the Florida aquifer onto the ocean floor at depths that would have placed them at the surface during the glacial period. Fossil remains of megafauna, mastodons, giant ground sloths, horses, have been recovered by commercial fishermen from the Gulf floor for decades, dredged up in nets alongside modern catch, and largely unreported, because reporting them produces no reward and considerable inconvenience. The sediment record on the submerged shelf has never been systematically cored for archaeological material. The technology to conduct that survey exists. The funding to conduct it has never been allocated, and the institutional framework that allocates archaeological funding operates on a timeline that places the shelf outside the range of serious inquiry before the first question is even asked. Now the one piece of cut sink that the grate and the closed office never reached. The cave diver who made the original discovery went back into the chamber before the hydrogeologist reached it on her dive and lifted the worked stone bowl from the platform behind the wall, wrapping it in a mesh collection bag, and never reported the recovery to the state's Division of Historical Resources as Florida law required. The bowl sits by his own account on a shelf in a house outside Alachua, unregistered, unstudied, photographed once on a disposable camera, in a print he keeps in a kitchen drawer. Two people who have seen it describe the same object independently, years apart with no contact between them. A shallow bowl roughly 9 inches across, interior worn smooth in a way neither attributes to weathering, worn the way a tool is worn by hands that return to it again and again across a very long time and then stopped. When asked why he has never submitted it for testing, he said only that he had watched what happened to the last set of photographs somebody else took of that chamber, and that the bowl was staying exactly where it was. It is the only physical evidence from Cutter Sink that institutional pressure has never been able to reach. And the reason it has stayed on that shelf for nearly 40 years is not that he fails to understand its potential significance. It is that he watched a hydrogeologist's career turn hard away from cave systems within months of a discovery that should have defined it, and concluded that submitting the bowl for institutional analysis would produce the same outcome. The object would enter a system that has demonstrated a consistent capacity to make inconvenient findings unreachable, and it would not come back. That calculation sits alongside something the Calusa oral tradition preserved that no institutional archive has ever placed beside it. The tradition describes specific named places, springs, rivers, settlements, in directions that now point out across open water, not vague ancestral memory of a better time. Specific geographic memory of specific locations that the water covered. Preserved across the millennia, it took the sea to rise 300 to 400 feet and swallow what the tradition was remembering. The oral tradition and the underwater sites are sitting in separate institutional categories, pointing at the same water. The oral tradition says the land was there and was occupied. The underwater sites say something was built on it. The submerged shelf says the land existed exactly where the tradition places it. And the access restrictions that keep the deepest chambers sealed, that keep the shelf unsurveyed, that keep the bowl on a private shelf outside Alachua, make the formal comparison between all three structurally impossible to conduct. The absence has learned where to stand. It clusters in exactly the places where the record would otherwise have the most to say. The deepest chambers, the oldest shelves, the most geographically specific oral tradition fragments, and it does so not through dramatic intervention but through the quiet operation of funding priorities, permit systems and institutional categories that were never designed to accommodate what sits on the other side of the accepted timeline. The wall at Cutter's Sink did not move, the bowl did not disappear, the oral tradition did not fade. What happened is quieter than any of those things. The mechanism that would examine them simply pointed somewhere else, and has been pointing somewhere else for nearly 40 years. There is a specific quality to what this investigation keeps finding. Not dramatic suppression, not classified files, something quieter and more durable. A pattern of gaps clustering in exactly the places where the record would otherwise have the most to say. The wall at Cutter's Sink is still there, 91 feet down. Dressed limestone standing level to within 2 inches in the dark, behind a grate bolted over the entrance shaft by a company that has never granted an interview about why it went up the year after a hydrogeologist's career changed direction without explanation. The chamber has not been surveyed since April 1987, not because the technology doesn't exist, not because the site is inaccessible, because the mechanism that generates archaeological surveys was not designed to accommodate findings that sit on the wrong side of the accepted timeline. Findings on the wrong side of that line don't get investigated, they get fenced. The Calusa oral tradition describing drowned territory is still in the Federal Archives, documented once, never compared to the underwater sites in the same geographic range, never placed beside the submerged springs on the Gulf floor, never held against the bowl on a shelf outside Alachua. Each piece in its own institutional category, the oral tradition in one archive, the underwater archaeology in another, the physical artifact in a private house, the submerged shelf unsurveyed between them, separated not by deliberate decision, by a system never built to connect them. The diver is 73 years old. The bowl has been on his shelf for nearly 4 decades. The notebook stubs are still visible where 3 pages were removed. The slides that left Iverson's office never came back. The grant records show funding was never applied for, each one individually explainable. Together they form a shape, consistent, geographically specific, of access withheld, findings absorbed without consequence, and oral traditions documented without integration, clustering around the same underwater landscape from 3 different directions. The submerged Florida shelf is still there, 300 to 400 feet of former landmass sitting underwater, that rose 12,000 years ago, unsurveyed, unfunded. The wall says someone was there. The oral tradition says the land was occupied. The shelf says the geography is exactly right. And the grate says the question is closed. It isn't. The bowl is still on the shelf, and the wall is still down there in the dark, waiting on the far side of a restriction most divers will never be cleared to pass, making the only argument a chamber has available to it, which is shape, fitted stone, 5 courses, joints that won't seat a dive knife, still standing, still waiting.